you haven't been with us yet this year, we are currently in the midst of a conversation called New. And we're looking at this powerful reality that even though we may have given up on it, even though we may have decided to settle for the old, this powerful reality that with Jesus, there truly is no end to the new. And that at the core of his message, at the core of his mission is this idea of new, that he wants for us to constantly be experiencing, stepping into the new that he has in store for us. Last week, we began this conversation, and we identified one of the areas in our lives that we are living in the old. As a matter of fact, right now, I want to encourage you, take out your phone and open up that notes app where we jotted that down last week. Go ahead, pull it out. I'll wait for you. If you weren't with us last week, go ahead and pull out your phone, open up your notes app, because we're going to be, as we walk through this conversation, as we walk through this series together, we're going to be taking notes throughout this whole thing, because we don't just want to know something at the end of this. We want to practice something. And so last week I asked you to identify, okay, where's one place in your life where you're living in the old? If you're just jumping into the conversation with us, you can identify this usually pretty quickly in your life. One place where you're living in the old, living in something that you want to leave behind. This isn't circumstantial. This is about who you are, the way you engage life, the way that you see the world. This isn't about your wardrobe and the fact that it needs to be updated. This is about who you are. And so what is one place where you're living in the old? Now let me build on that a little bit, because hopefully as you walk through this week and you're thinking about this and processing this, and I know some of you forgot it the moment you walked out and have just come back to it. But as you're working through this, I want to encourage you to not just identify where you think you're living in the old, but to actually engage God about this. Because you see, God has the ability to be able to understand and the ability to see the domino effect of change in your life. What I mean by that is this. Have you ever changed one thing and then everything changed? And you didn't expect it. You didn't see those connections. You didn't see that coming. But that one thing was contributing to far more in your life than you thought previously. And that one change has this huge domino effect in your life. I remember when I was younger, I made a change that I didn't expect it to change as much as it did. It changed everything. Because when I was young, I decided that I was no longer going to be a fan of the New York Mets. It changed everything for me. It didn't just make the next year better. It made the rest of my life better. One change. No, you know what I'm talking about. That domino effect of change, where sometimes that one little thing, it can set into motion something that changes everything. You don't have the wisdom to know that, to understand that in your life, but God does. And so if you're walking into this and you're saying, I need to work on this, I want to work on this, I want to step into the new here, and you feel like God's drawing you towards something else, pay attention to what it is that he's pointing you to, because that may actually be at the core of what it is that you're trying to change, even though you don't understand it. We follow him into this. We don't lead him into this. So engage him in that conversation. Okay, God, where am I living in the old that I need to address, that you're calling me to address first in my life? And then coming out of last week, I asked you to do some homework. Now, again, some of you are like, oh, that's right. I should have thought about that. But it's okay. You can catch up. I asked you to do the homework of looking at where you're living in the old and then identifying what would it look like to live in the new. What would it look like? Not just identifying the old, but identifying the new. I want to build on that a little bit as well, because I know that when we walk through this process, often as I'm walking through this process with people, they'll identify the old, and then when we talk about the new, they think the new is just the elimination of the old. So they think the new is, okay, I'm going to stop worrying. The old is that I worry. The new is that I stop worrying. No, no, no. The new is not that you stop worrying. The new is that you in faith have hope and operate in hope. That you move into the day with expectation as opposed to worry. You stop talking to yourself, you start talking to him. The new is not the elimination of the old. The new is the opposite of the old. And so as you did your homework, if your new is just the elimination of, you haven't gone far enough yet. And I want to encourage you to take that next step with what you're jotting down there and in those notes to really push yourself to say, no, what would the new be? It's not just that I'm going to stop losing my temper with my roommate. It's that I'm going to be encouraging with my roommate. It's one of my friends was explaining this in his life, and he talked about how the old in his life was sarcasm, and he was consistently using sarcasm to be able to bring down the people around him. And he said sarcasm is using truth to injure or to bring down the people in your life. And so he said, I wanted to switch. I wanted to step into the new. It wasn't just that I was going to stop being sarcastic. It's that I was going to work on being encouraging, because encouraging is using truth to build others up. That's the new. And this is really important, because if the new for you is just the elimination of the old, you're never going to get excited about it. Nobody gets excited about, I'm not going to be. And Jesus doesn't step into your life and say, I want for you to not be. Jesus steps into your life and says, I want you to be. What is it that he wants for you to be? What is the new? You can get excited about that. It's not just that he wants for us to take off. He wants for us to put on. What is the new that Jesus gave his life for you to experience, to live in, to embody, to bring to the world around you? We identify the old. We identify the new. But that leads us to one very important question, doesn't it? And that question is, how? Okay, I see where I'm living in the old. I see what it would look like to live in the new. But how? I mean, how do you actually practice this? You look at this verse that we looked at last week, Ephesians 4, beginning of verse 22. It says, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. He says, I want for you to put on the new self. I want for you to experience this. And it's interesting because as he continues, he gives us all sorts of examples of what this looks like. And he talks to what we just talked about, that it's not just the elimination of, but it's the opposite of. Listen to how he continues after he talks to us about practicing this. He says, therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. It's the opposite. He says, I want it to be the opposite, not just the elimination of. It's the opposite. For we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. He who has been stealing, what is he supposed to do? It's not just that he stopped stealing. Listen to what it says. Must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with his hands, that he may have something to share. He says, I want for you to step into the new. It's different. It's the opposite of. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up. Again, it's not just that I stop talking negatively. I start encouraging according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And he's giving example after example after example after example of how we move from the old to the new. But how do you actually do it? We don't just want to understand a concept. We want to practice this. In order to help us understand that, I want to take us to the book of Romans. God's using Paul to write to the church at Rome, and as he's writing to them, he speaks to the how. He talks about the transformation, the fact that we've been made new, and then he speaks to the how of how we take off the old and put on the new. Let me take you to that passage. Listen what it says. It says, you, however, are controlled not by the sinful nature, but by the Spirit. So he starts off and he speaks to what we talked about last week, which was this, that the problem with us and God is not just what we do, it's who we are. And he says, this is who you used to be. You used to be controlled by your sinful nature. This is what used to define you, but now you've been made new. You're no longer controlled by your sinful nature. He says, but by the Spirit. If the Spirit of God lives in you, and if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he does not belong to Christ. The second you step into this relationship with God, you're given God's Spirit. He says, but if Christ is in you, your body is dead because of sin. Now, let me just focus in on this again, because some of you are like, no, I'm not dead. I'm here, at least today, and hopefully tomorrow. But I want to draw us back to something that for the last year I've been trying to kind of help us grasp and to hold on to as we're interacting with God's Word. When the Scriptures talk about death, and we've mentioned this multiple times as we've walked through this year, when the Scriptures talk about death, it's not talking, almost every time it talks about, it's not talking about physical death. It's talking about spiritual death. And so he's saying the reality is that Christ has made you new, but your body, your flesh is still in the old. It's still spiritually dead. It still has, as we talked about last week, those same hang-ups, those same habits, those same tendencies, those same appetites. He says the reality is your flesh still has that, yet your spirit is alive because of the righteousness of Jesus that's been given to you. And he's talking about what we talked about last week, that we've been made new from the inside out, but we still have our flesh, which has those old habits, those hang-ups, that still wants to live in the old. And so he continues and he talks about how do we move into this? How do we address this? He says, and if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, now let's look at this real quick. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you. Now here, what he's talking about is power. What he's speaking to is power. And he's pointing out not only that you have the Spirit of God living in you, but he's talking about the power of the Spirit that lives in you. He says, and if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead, I don't know if you know this or not, but when Jesus gives his life for us, he doesn't raise himself from the dead. It's God's Spirit that raises him from the dead. And in this moment, Paul's saying, not only have you been made new from the inside out, not only have you been given God's Spirit, but let me remind you how powerful this Spirit is. Let me remind you how much, what he was able to do, what he can do. Because I want you to understand the power source that you've been given, which is why he draws our attention to the fact that he rose Jesus from the dead. He says, and if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. He says, even though you still have that flesh, you have the power to be able to overcome that. You have the power to be able to experience the new because you've been made new, and you have this power source in you. You have access to the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead. So I want for you to understand, not only have you been made new, but he's literally given you access to the same power source that raised Jesus from the dead. He's literally given you access not just to his Spirit, but to his power. To be able to overcome all those habits, those tendencies, those appetites that want to draw you to the old. He said, no, you have access to the power that you need. You say, how? I mean, how do I make that transition? He said, no, it's not through your strength, it's through this strength. It's through his strength. It's through this power. And I want for you to understand that the same Spirit that brought Jesus back from the dead, that same power is in you. So listen to what he says. He continues. He says, therefore, brothers, we have an obligation, but it is not to the sinful nature to live according to it. For if you live according to the sinful nature, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live, because those who are led by the Spirit are sons of God, he says, I want for you to understand not only that you've been made new, but that the Spirit of God is working in you to be able to lead you into the new. Not just to instruct you. I think for some of us, we think, okay, God's put his Spirit in my life to just instruct me. No, he didn't just put his Spirit in your life to instruct you. He put his Spirit in your life to empower you. To give you the strength to be able to do this. To be able to actually move from the old to the new. But later on, just a couple of verses later, it talks about how his Spirit helps us. Romans 8:26, in the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. The emphasis isn't our strength, it's his strength. And God's stepping into our lives and saying, you have to understand that you have access to the power that you need, and it's not your power, it's not your strength, it's his strength. But unfortunately, for many of us, rather than living in that, rather than experiencing that, we're missing it. Have you ever been working on an electronic and it just won't work? You keep working on it, you're trying to figure it out, and you can't get it to work. You've tried everything. You've gone back to the user manual and you're researching YouTube channels to figure out how and you're just at the end of yourself, and then your friend walks in and plugs it in. Have you ever experienced that? So I see someone looking at the person next to them like it happens often. It's the worst. It's the worst. You're sitting there, you're working and working. I can't figure it out. And then the simplest solution. One of my great fears as we walk through this, and we talk about stepping out of the old and stepping into the new. One of my great fears is that we're going to try to do this for God. Is that we're going to step into this and say, you know what? Yeah, I need to take off the old and I need to put on the new. And I'm going to accomplish this for you. Listen, sometimes this happens with my boys where we'll have a project that we're going to work on or something that needs to happen, and I'll say, okay, guys, this is what we're going to do. And they'll say, all right, I'm going to do that. So for give you an example, the other day, my boys were heading to their grandparents' house to be able to spend the night. And so I said to my middle son, I said, all right, Kale, we got to go pack. And he said, all right, I'll go pack. And I said, no, Kale, no. Because you know what I know about Kale when he packs? He'll end up with 14 pairs of pajamas, no underwear. It's a disaster. I'm like, no, I don't need you to do this for me. I need you to do this with me. Otherwise, it's going to mess the whole thing up. And one of my great fears is that as we step into this, is that we're going to be like, all right, God, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to take it off and put it on. And God's like, no, wait. No. This isn't something that you do for me. This is something you do with me. And this isn't something that you do on your own strength. This is something that I'm going to do in my strength, in and through you. Listen to what it says in the book of Philippians. It says, he is the one who gives us the power to make the change. For it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. He is the one who gives us the power to change. For it is God, it's him. He's the one who's working in us to will, not only to instruct us, not only give us the desire to do it, but to actually do it. One of the other translations says to will and to do. To will and to do. He's the one who's making that happen. God says, no, I don't want you to go out there and try to take that thing off and put that next thing on. You have to understand something. I'm the only one who can make that happen in your life. I'm the source of power in your life when it comes to this. I'm the one who's going to give you the strength to do this. I'm going to do this through you. But just like that electronic, unfortunately, for many of us, we're living our lives. And you look at that situation, it's absurd. How could you possibly not check the power cord? Well, of course you have to make sure that you're plugged in. But unfortunately, for many of us, that's exactly how we're living our lives. We're unplugged. And God stepped in and said, no, I don't want you to do this for me. I want to do this in you. I want to do this through you. But unfortunately for many of us, rather than being plugged into him, we've unplugged. It's not that we've completely unplugged. It's just that we don't plug in very often. There are a lot of different ways to be able to plug in. As a matter of fact, you're doing one of them right now. One of the reasons why we come together every Sunday is to be able to plug in to God's Spirit, to be able to remind ourselves of what he's done for us, to be able to experience him. One of the reasons why we do silence every week here at Hoboken Grace is because it's not just about what we're going to learn. It's about who we're going to experience. It's about the relationship that we have with him. It's about plugging into God's Spirit, not just having access to it, but actually experiencing his Spirit, understanding that he's with us, allowing him to be able to speak into and to fill our lives, to give us the power to be able to do what it is that God's called us to do. But unfortunately for many of us, we plug in here on Sunday morning and then we expect to make it through the week. You're like, all right, I'm gonna plug in on Sunday morning. I'm gonna be good for the week. And we ignore a very, very important principle, something that I know about myself, something that I know about you, and that is this: you have a terrible battery life. Like really bad. And so you plug in on Sunday morning, you're like, all right, I'm good. You don't even make it to Sunday night. It's not that it runs out on Monday morning, it runs out Sunday night. Sometimes it's like by the end of the block. Because you don't hold charge well. And one of the great mistakes that we make is that we think we have this incredible battery life. You need to, when you think about your battery life, your ability to hold charge, the picture that should come to mind is an early generation iPhone. Do you remember early generation iPhones? Do you remember those? You had to plug them in every 15 minutes. You're going to turn the screen on? Better plug it in. That thing's going to be dead. It was immediate. That's us. That's us. And we're like, I don't understand why I can't. I don't understand why you're unplugged. Yeah, but I plugged in on Sunday. Yeah. You got a lousy battery. And that's okay. Those early generation iPhones changed the world, didn't they? As long as you kept them plugged in. The same thing is true with you. God wants to use you to change the world. As long as you keep plugged in. As long as you keep plugged in. And there are a lot of different ways to plug in. Being here in this space as we come together is a powerful way to plug in. Groups. You hear us talk about groups all the time. Groups is another powerful way to plug in. This month we've got new groups launching. Groups are always available for you to be able to step into. Our starting point groups that we talked about last week. If you're trying to figure out faith, and Starting Point is an amazing place to be able to begin that journey. If you're coming back to faith, Starting Point is an amazing place. In the app, you'll be able to see, you can sign up for those groups. We have FPU groups that are starting. It's all about plugging in. You can't just plug in once a week. And for some of us, we're engaging this journey, and we're trying to step from the old to the new, and you're working so hard. But just like that electronic, it doesn't matter how hard you work. If it's not plugged in, it won't run. And you can spend the rest of your life trying to fix that thing. But until you plug it in, it's not going to work. There's no workaround. One of the things that we do every year here at Hope and Grace is something called the Bible reading plan. We read through the New Testament together. It's all about plugging in. If you go on our app under Rhythms, you'll see the New Testament Bible reading plan. You can subscribe to it. We'll email you one chapter of the New Testament every day for the rest of the year, or every weekday for the rest of the year. You'll be able to read through the entire New Testament with us. It's about consistently plugging in. Rhythms here at Hoboken Grace, if you see that on your app, you can read more about it on the app. It's all about consistently plugging in. It's about not just plugging in on a daily basis, but plugging in multiple times a day. Why? Because we don't hold charge well. And God said, I've given you my Spirit. And I want to do this in you and through you. But I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. It's my strength. But you've got to plug in. Go ahead, take your phones out. We've identified the old. Now we've identified the new. Go ahead. I know you have them with you. Here's what I want for you to do. Now that you've identified the old and the new, I want for you to write down how you're plugging in. I want for you to identify. Write it out. Where and how are you currently plugging in? What does that look like in your life? Maybe for you it's just Sunday morning. Maybe for you it's Sunday morning in a group or Sunday morning in an impact team. Maybe for you it's a Bible reading plan. What is it? How are you currently plugging in? Now I want you to ask yourself a question. Do you believe that that's sufficient to provide you the power to move from the old to the new? And your homework this week is this. Your homework this week is to engage God with this question. God, how do you want me to plug in? What does that need to look like in my life? And to figure out the changes that need to be made between what you just wrote down and what he's calling you to. Listen to me. Listen. Some of you are working so hard to move from the old to the new. You're working so hard. I want to invite you into something. I want to invite you to take the energy that you're putting into moving from the old to the new, take that energy and put it into plugging in. And see if maybe, just maybe, it isn't him who works in us to will and to do. If you're going to work hard at something, work at plugging in. And see if he's actually told us the truth, that it's him, that it's his strength that works in us to will and to do. Don't do something for him. Experience something with him. There is no end to the new with Jesus. But it's not because of our strength. It's because of his. And it's the result of us being plugged in to him. Will you pray with me? Father, I pray again, as we walk through this, that this would not just be something that we know, but that we would do the homework. We'd do the homework of looking at, okay, what does my plan look like now? And God, what do you want my plan to look like? And how do I make sure that I'm not operating in my own strength? How do I make sure that I'm plugged in? How do I confront the reality that I can't just experience that. I can't just plug in once a week. I have to live my life in light of, in connection to, in unity with your Spirit. Father, I pray that as a result, we would experience you working in us to will and to do. As a result, we would begin to actually move from the old to the new. Not just that we can experience the new, but so that the world around us can see the power of what you can do in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.